David, I will let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashira. I have to say, Ashira, it's a little disorienting to have this voice coming from, who's saying that, you know? It is the voice of God, indeed. Well, welcome. My name is David Reinecke. I'm a Foreign Affairs Officer at the U.S. Department of State. I work principally in the Office of Space Affairs on the Artemis Accords. So I think at some point, if this issue is to mature, outer space heritage will be part of my, my file or portfolio. So I'm really today asking questions of our esteemed panelists for the things I want to know so I can help do my job better in the years to come. We're talking about policy and law of outer space heritage, and I can just say from what I understand, there's not a lot to date, right? But I think with that comes a lot of opportunities, a lot of conversations that we need to start having today and elsewhere, not only domestically, but internationally as well. And I'm hoping with the panel today, we can kind of get into that. So I want to introduce very quickly my esteemed panelists before we hop into the conversation. And I'll just say as a bit of ground rules, I'm hoping this will be a kind of open conversation, a generative conversation. I was very explicit to say we should not have a lot of PowerPoint slides or something like that. Let's keep this fun and engaging. So next to me is Ellen Gertsen. She is the Deputy Associate Administrator for NASA's Office of Technology, Policy, and Strategy. Sounds like a very cool office.
It is.
Gertsen also supports the Associate Administrator in providing data and evidence-driven technology policy and strategy advice to NASA leadership, engages with the technology and space policy communities. She's here today doing exactly that, and oversees the office's space environment sustainability portfolio, which has been an area I know of a lot of activity recently. She joined NASA in 2003, wow, as a President Management Fellow, and has extensive experience leading policy development, performance management, strategic planning, and organizational change initiatives. Next to Ellen is Professor Mai'a Davis-Cross, the Dean's Professor of Political Science, International Affairs, and Diplomacy, and the Director for the Center of International Affairs and World Cultures at Northeastern University. Professor Cross's research, among many other things, focuses on international cooperation, European foreign and security policy, transatlantic relations, diplomacy, public diplomacy, and the reason she's on this panel today, space diplomacy. Her work on space addresses key questions related to the geopolitics of space. Hopefully we'll get into that today a little bit. The future of human space exploration, public-private collaboration on space technology, and space as a global commons. That last bit, the GC word, I don't know. I have some strong reactions to that, but we can save that for later. Next to Mai'a is Mike Gold. Very pleased to see him on the panel today. He is the Chief Growth Officer at Redwire, so a commercial space leader. But part of the reason he's on this panel today is that prior to joining Redwire, Mr. Gold was NASA's Associate Administrator for Space Policy and Partnerships and Acting Associate Administrator for the Office of International and Interagency Relations and Senior Advisor to the Administrator for International and Legal Affairs. That's a lot of hats, Mike.
Try to fit all that in one card.
At NASA, Mr. Gold led the development and implementation of the Artemis Accords, which I'm hoping we're going to talk about in depth today, which established norms of behavior to ensure a peaceful and prosperous future in space for all of humanity. Mr. Gold also led the successful negotiations to develop and execute the binding agreements for Lunar Gateway, a really key program that's kept together the ISS partners, or ISS partners -1, the development and implementation of the first lunar resource purchased by NASA, which I think is also something interesting for today's conversation, and updating planetary protection regulations. And I see there's a much larger bio here, Mike, but I'm sure we can get into it a little bit later. And next to Mike, very pleased to see Michelle Hanlon is the Executive Director for Air and Space Law Program at the University of Mississippi School of Law and its Center for Air and Space Law. She is the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Space Law and the Journal of Drone Law and Policy. Man, I've so many questions there. Michelle is a co-founder and president of For All Moonkind, a nonprofit corporation that is the only organization in the world, only one, focused on protecting human cultural heritage in outer space. So we literally have the world expert here on outer space heritage. So I want to take a thank you so much for joining us. I have a series of targeted questions and answers that I'm going to turn to you. But I think to start off this panel, and we'll just go one by one, quick, 2 to 3 minutes each, what is your personal or professional connection to outer space heritage? And what do you anticipate as the major policy challenge associated with preserving outer space heritage? So Ellen, I will turn it over to you.
So I'm going to take a page, I think, from the first panel and talk a little bit about perhaps my personal connection back to Apollo, which is that my grandfather was one of those engineers that designed the LEM. And so I had always grown up hearing the stories about that. And so now for my kids, being able to transfer stories about when I worked on Mars rovers and opportunities maybe in the future to go and see them, it's an important topic for me personally, but also for what we do in my office at NASA. You talked a little bit. We're there to provide that advice, an independent analysis to NASA senior leadership about emerging issues using that blend of technology and policy and economics, and just reflecting back over the course of my career at NASA and how different the space environment is right now, how complex it is right now, and really starting to think through about what that complexity means and also the rate of change and how do we position not just NASA, but really the whole world for success is just such an important question. And so I'm glad we're having this session so we can start digging into some of these issues.
Hi, it's great to be here. And one of the things that really drew me into focusing on space is just the whole history of international cooperation in outer space, including during the space race. And that to me is fascinating because I think, on average, people just assume the space race was about this cutthroat competition on the verge of conflict. But if you really dig deeper, as I'm sure everyone in this room has done, space diplomacy characterizes so much of what has occurred during this period of time and up to the present. And I think it shows that space is almost in itself a kind of separate area that has this unifying power, even as there are all these controversies to look into, and that there's a lot of threat, and many people talk about space as the next battlefield. You could also really, really emphasize and understand kind of the ways that it can overcome much of this in a kind of unique way. So that's what has drawn me into looking at this as a scholar of the European Union, where you also see something where there was cooperation beyond anyone's expectations, and it still continues to be the case. I think there actually are some parallels with space. Heritage in particular is fascinating to me in terms of my work on cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy. So I think, I tend to look more at heritage as a dynamic thing. Heritage is usually defined as more of sort of our human culture rooted in the past, but it also continues to live on. And so especially when we talk about space, it's in the present and in the future. Those things will eventually become heritage. But currently, really, it is this dynamism, and in that sense, I think there's actually hope. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, for preserving outer space heritage is going to be kind of getting internationally countries to agree and be on the same page that this is a challenge for space diplomacy. How do you create treaties or agreements or norms that everyone can share? At the same time, though, we can see in looking at diplomacy that oftentimes when countries are in the most dire conflictual situations, they can still cooperate when it comes to science and when it comes to culture. Science diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and space kind of sits right there. So I think there's a lot to be discussed when it comes to the challenge of space diplomacy, but at the same time, I'm actually quite hopeful that this could be kind of the fulcrum to creating interactions across otherwise conflictual countries that could help even in those conflicts, because space can kind of bring people together in that sense.
So space heritage means a lot to me personally. My grandfather worked on the Apollo program. My mother's in the space industry, so I'm third generation. And I love a good space museum. Like, I love coming and checking it out. I'm a Star Trek fan. Where are my Star Trek fans out there? So, growing up as someone who loved space, loved Star Trek, was overweight in Montana, really made me popular in high school. Just checking all the boxes there. And where I encountered space heritage was obviously in my policy roles at NASA. And even before that, in the private sector, I was part of something called the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group. The name rolls off the tongue. And as we look at this transition from government to the private sector, I think that the NGOs are going to play a lot more important role because our system was not set up to accommodate, from a policy perspective, the role that the private sector is playing now. And I think the NGOs, as the Hague Group did, will really influence that. Later on, I was talking to Jim Bridenstine about this crazy idea called the Artemis Accords, based on the Khitomer Accords from Star Trek. And he was telling me, if you don't come to NASA, it's never going to happen. So I made my wife very upset and came to NASA to push forward with the Accords. First person I called was Gabriel Swinney, of course, who already had ideas and was thinking along those lines. And then really because of the person next to me, who had done such an incredible job of raising the issue of heritage. And at groups like The Hague with the Artemis Accords, we knew that heritage had to be a piece of that. So I'll talk more about the Accords later on, but I also want to mention two other areas that heritage has been impacting me in my career is COSPAR, then the Planetary Protection Panel. So I serve as the industry representative to the Planetary Protection Panel on COSPAR. And you wouldn't normally think of heritage, right? Of course, Michelle would because she's an expert. But when you look at some of these sites, because there are microbes from humans, et cetera, you want to protect the heritage sites not only because of the importance historically, but due to the scientific value as well, which is something that I didn't think about initially on it, but it comes to us there. And then finally at Redwire, we're looking to work on the moon. We're building the rollout solar arrays for the Gateway. These will be the largest arrays ever deployed by humanity. Building the International Berthing and Docking Mechanism in Belgium that will literally assemble it. And then, even more relevant, we're building Mason, which is a system that will take regolith, sinter it using radiation to create roads, berms, and potentially even structures. We have a contract from NASA STMD. So not only conducting those activities, but that's historic in itself. And then how do we operate to treat with respect other historic activities, heritage activities? And also, and I'll talk more about this later, how do we prevent heritage from being used offensively to keep people from doing things? Because I think that is the greatest challenge. We all agree heritage is important, or at least I hope we all do in this room, but it's in the implementation, that devil in the details, as to how we get from the high-level principle to actual detailed information. I'll leave that much harder problem to a real expert like Michelle.
So I'm a child of Star Trek. I really came into space through Star Trek, not Apollo, interestingly. And I spent 25 years as an M&A attorney and then decided that I'm going to follow my Star Trek roots and try and figure out how to mine asteroids, because apparently that's what my son wants to do. So when I was at McGill earning my LLM, Jan Werner, who was then the head of the European Space Agency, was on a junket to China pushing this concept of the moon village. And he said, China, you must come with Europe to the moon, if only to take down those American flags. And so my initial concept, my initial approach to heritage was very much a patriotic, wait a minute, you can't do that. You know, my parents were both Foreign Service officers. I grew up all over the world. You know, that flag was so important to me, to us. And so we created, my husband and I, who is a child of Apollo, created For All Moonkind to protect the Apollo sites. But then a really interesting thing happened. As we talked to people around the world, we realized that the Apollo sites are not American, they're human. This is a universally celebrated event. If we talk about the messages of peace that went with the Apollo astronauts, it's 74 nations. If you read those messages of peace, every single one of them talks about kinship, talks about hopes for peace. And we are, For All Moonkind, as a permanent observer to the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, so I've had the opportunity to talk to delegates. There's not one country in the world that says this is a dumb idea, right? Nobody has said, no, why would we protect? Everybody says, yes, but it's really hard. And so we at For All Moonkind have created, we have lawyers, heritage experts like my colleague here, Marlene. Robert Perlman is on our leadership board. We've brought experts together to understand, what should be protected, how it should be protected. But most of all, we have lawyers from every single inhabited continent in the world participating in this, including lawyers from China and Russia, because when you think about going to the moon, and you think about Neil Armstrong's boot print, a lot of people say, that's 400,000 Americans who are part of the NASA program, right? And actually, it's much, much more than that. We're talking about, millennia of humans who have looked up at the moon and wanted to go there. We don't get to the moon unless one of our ancestors, our common ancestor in Tanzania, stands up on 2 feet, right? Frees their hands to make tools. We don't get to the moon without learning how to communicate with each other. We don't get to the moon without, learning math. All of these are fundamental human things and experiences that all were involved in that boot print. And so when we talk about protecting heritage, we're really talking about taking that first step towards peace.
Excellent. Michelle, very inspiring stuff. I was getting a little bit of chills towards the end of that. So I want to quickly go through some targeted Q&A, really kind of pick a little bit at the expertise that we have assembled on this panel to help us kind of understand the state of outer space heritage policy more broadly. And then we can go to kind of more open Q&A, and then hopefully time permitting, and I'm sure there's lots of questions in the audience for the panel assembled up here. So Michelle, starting with you, I'm kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, but can you help us set the stage and review the existing state of domestic and international outer space heritage law? Can you take us through a tutorial in 5 minutes or something about where we're at and what we need to do looking forward?
Absolutely, thank you. So I think the previous panel noted it started with the Google Lunar X Prize, right? When we started realizing, oh, wait, you can't go back to Apollo. We heard about the plume effect and how damaging it is to even get close to these sites. And so that Google Lunar X Prize, that special prize for an Apollo artifact, was the impetus to create the 2011 guidelines at NASA. These guidelines are voluntary. They were created by sort of an ad hoc group, including Phil Metzger, who's an expert in the plume effect. But even Phil Metzger says, we have no idea. We had no idea in 2011 how to manage this. And so he literally pretended there was a 6-foot person on the surface of the moon and just projected out to the horizon and thought that would be the kind of protection we need. So that's where we have guidelines which say please don't get within 2 kilometers of the Apollo 11 lunar landing site. And there were similar concepts for the robotic sites as well. But these were voluntary. They were not even binding on U.S. citizens. So then we came along. For All Moonkind was looking at this issue and trying to figure out what to do. We started at the international level because, as we know, it has to be an international effort. And so we talked to Senator Gary Peters of Michigan and said, one thing we can do is make those voluntary guidelines binding, at least on U.S. citizens, right? We can't project to the rest of the world, but we can become leaders in this concept. And so we drafted the One Small Step Act, which was signed into law in 2020. And that, unfortunately, we drafted it to say it would be binding on all U.S. Citizens. It's binding only on those entities that are doing work with NASA, but that does capture also some foreign entities. So we have that national legislation. Russia also has national legislation which says it has the right to create safety zones around its own heritage. We have the Hague Space Resources Working Group, which mentions heritage. We're starting to get a lot of NGOs talking about heritage. The biggest step forward we've had recently is in 2024, another astronaut, Doran Pernario, from the delegate from Romania, suggested that perhaps at the UN level we create a lunar activities action team, ATLAC, as another one that just rolls off the tongue. And in that ATLAC, one of the line items is that one of the things we have to coordinate is protection of heritage. So we've gone from, this NASA guidelines. I skipped over the Eddie Bernice Johnson, let's make them all national parks, because that wouldn't violate the Outer Space Treaty. To now the Artemis Accords Section 9, which were implemented in 2020. Again, U.S. leadership in that effort to show, okay, we understand that we are going to be sort of taking away some of this freedom of exploration and use, but we also believe it's important. So we're really grateful for that. But that's where we are. And so we have at the UN level, we've had Canada, Romania, Switzerland talk about heritage protection. We know we have great friends in Greece and Italy with respect to that, and we're slowly building this movement. And again, we are just delighted that you're hosting an entire summit on outer space heritage. And so we feel, we'll take credit. We feel like we're turning our baby step into a giant leap.
We're in a good place, and it often follows this trajectory of voluntary guidelines, domestic law, international conversations, and then maybe one day, working up to the granddaddy of them all, a treaty or something. And we'll get back to this treaty question in a little bit. Mike, I want to turn to you and talk about the Artemis Accords. So for people who are not familiar, because I've given this spiel a bunch, they're a non-binding political commitment to a set of principles to uphold the safe, sustainable, and transparent use of outer space. It includes things, commonsensical best practices on things like orbital debris, deconfliction on the lunar surface, and Section 9, which is one of the more curious sections on outer space heritage, right? Lunar heritage. So
If you ask Michelle, it's the most important section. Right?
Absolutely.
Favorite section.
So I'm curious, help us set the stage a little bit for where Section 9 came from, your kind of overall vision for the Artemis Accords, and then I want you to drill down, as you said, I'm glad you got there. I was going to kind of push you, but you did it for me, of implementation, right? So it does seem to set up some complications, right, that it could be used and abused. So take us through a little bit of the history and then the forward-looking vision for Section 9.
And I'll first say I do think ATLAC is catchy because everyone keeps calling it AFLAC. Yeah, I've fallen into that hole already this morning. Let's just talk about the Artemis Accords fundamentally for a moment. That if you looked at beyond LEO human spaceflight at NASA, failure wasn't just an option, it was a certainty. I mean, I know I look young, right? But like in my entire life, we have not had a single beyond LEO human spaceflight program come to fruition, not since Apollo. And going back to the previous administration under Administrator Jim Bridenstine, we really thought there were two reasons for that. One, lack of bipartisanship. And Jim had that covered as a former politician. Senator Nelson has done a wonderful job of that, leading NASA as well. But then the second we thought was international. That if you contrast beyond LEO to what's happening in LEO, there the International Space Station has been a bedrock of human space flight. And part of the reason for that is the first word in the name is international. So we knew for the Artemis program to survive and to thrive, it had to be global. And the purpose of the Artemis Accords was to create the broadest, most diverse, global human spaceflight program in history. And we may have gotten the ball rolling, but thanks to your work, David, and Valda, and JR, and Pam Elroy, and the Vice President herself, and Senator Nelson, and everyone at NASA, OIR, et cetera, 42 countries have now signed the Artemis Accords. 42.
Woohoo!
That's worth applauding. Answer to life, the universe, and everything. And I love when it lines up in the chart so well as well. The feng shui of the chart is
that makes me very happy.
Yeah, I just when we're going to get 43. Well, I'll love it. It's going to mess things up. Every year is you can see I try to hold a birthday party for the Accords, and we do an Artemis Accords cake. We're going to need a bigger cake. Like I'm really excited. So kudos to everyone on a bipartisan basis that have pushed the Accords forward. So part of the idea was, yes, to support explicitly the Artemis program, to build momentum for it, to build sustainability. But the other part was to leverage the popularity of humanity's return to the moon and the Artemis program to create norms of behavior that would result in a peaceful and prosperous future in space for all of humanity. And that's where we get to heritage, that there are a number of aspects to the Accords that we thought were important, and that for any country that's participating in the Accords, they needed to abide by these principles. And it all stems from the Outer Space Treaty, the spine, backbone of international space law, over 60 years old now, doesn't look a day over 35. As relevant today as it was in the 60s when it was adopted. Those principles are eternal. But you can't take the Outer Space Treaty, give it to NASA engineers and say, do this. So the Artemis Accords were an attempt to take those valuable, laudable principles of the Outer Space Treaty, bring it down a level so that we knew how to implement these principles. Otherwise, they're just words on a page. One of the few criticisms that I have for the Outer Space Treaty is if you violate it, there are almost no repercussions. And for the first time, the Artemis Accords put teeth into the Outer Space Treaty. At the very least, if you violate the Outer Space Treaty, if you violate the Accords, you can't be a part of the Artemis program. There's repercussion for the first time, which I think is very important to actually enforcing heritage. Now, when it comes to heritage itself, we face the dilemma in terms of how much detail do we get into here. Because for anyone who's worked with heritage, we could have spent 20 pages talking about what is heritage, how do you define it, how are we going to implement it. The Accords themselves are only about 5 pages long. It's a page turner. Everyone should read the Accords. But we knew we had to hit a balance where we wanted to raise the issue of heritage because it was important. We wanted anyone going to the surface of the moon or Mars to respect heritage. But we knew that if we went into too much detail, we probably wouldn't be able to get the Accords done entirely. We wouldn't be able to get them adopted, and we'd get bogged down. And we should always keep in mind that the Accords are a beginning of a conversation, not an ending. People will often come to me and say, well, how much value is there if China and Russia haven't signed? I am a recovering attorney, and I believe in the power of precedent. Precedent is important. That even if China and Russia never signed the Accords, we've started a conversation. We've shown what good looks like. And the more momentum, and this is why numbers are important, the more countries that sign, the more pressure there is for even countries that haven't adopted by the Accords to do the right thing, and particularly when it comes to something like space heritage. So we try to articulate, again, based on some of the wonderful work that Michelle and her group had done and what we've done in The Hague, you need to respect heritage and lay down some guidelines at least, and then leaving it to follow-on discussions, which, of course, you and NASA have done, just most recently in Canada, I believe, with the Artemis Accord sessions, to talk together as a group, a family of nations. How are we going to achieve these values? How are we going to implement things like heritage? How are we going to achieve interoperability? How are we going to have avoidance of harmful interference? And the key, as we're saying, and we see this both in the safety zone issue, which is interrelated to heritage, and on heritage itself, is how do you avoid it being used offensively? The great fear is that someone could leverage heritage or put down buoys or who knows what on the moon, and it could be used inappropriately, it could be used offensively to prevent legitimate exploration. And that's the difficulty that we have. Again, thanks to Michelle and other people's great work, we're tackling this issue both at the UN and in NGOs, and that is the work that we have ahead of us to define heritage protection in such a way that it can be implemented in a constructive and productive fashion.
Excellent. Ellen, over to you. So I'm going to ask you to put your NASA capital N hat on. So after several decades of planetary exploration, NASA has considerable heritage really out there. There's things to protect, right? This is not just a future conversation. There's things on the moon, for example, and I'm really appreciative of the presentation earlier from Tom and Teasel's panel, kind of setting out some of the objects that are out there. Can you describe, maybe the 2011 voluntary guidelines are an example of this, of what NASA's policies and plans are for protecting this heritage, right? Like, what is the work that NASA is either doing now or has done in the past or is anticipating to do in the future to kind of tackle this issue and create these kinds of policies and plans and implementation and engineering requirements, right, for how the protection of heritage is going to get done for NASA objects?
Yeah, and appreciate that question. And, I think about this through the lens, again, of how quickly the space environment is evolving and recognizing that from the perspective of the U.S. government, we want to encourage that commercial activity that's going to take place on the moon, but it brings challenges with it, the same way that the increased activity of different governments brings challenges with it. And so from a NASA perspective, there are things like that 2011 report that we've talked about. There are things like the legislation that we talked about, but there's still big gaps out there. And so I think what might be helpful is actually, let me talk through a couple of them, because that's really, I think, where some of these interesting questions will start to come up. And it's not just a question about NASA protecting NASA assets per se, but it's how are we as a global space community going to think about each other's activities on the moon. And so one of the things that we can point to already is the registration convention. So you can go to the website and pull up information about where NASA objects are located in space. But what's really interesting about that is when you think about objects on the lunar surface, all the registration convention tells you is that it's on the moon. It doesn't actually tell you where on the lunar surface something is, because all of the information is really designed for orbital assets. And so if we want to think about how do I set up a safety zone, how do I ensure that my activities don't conflict with what somebody else is going to do, well, somebody needs to know where my things are. And obviously, from the NASA perspective, we know where our objects are, but how does somebody else come in and get that information, and how do we get that same kind of information from somebody else? Another thing that we're thinking about is obviously through the Artemis Accords, what's a reasonable safety zone, and how do we avoid that kind of harmful interference? And so there's work that's already being done to think about that, but the Artemis Accords just outline those existing principles. There's this next level work that we really have to do to think about heritage, and future work will be to develop a framework for how we can communicate with other Artemis signatories and even non-signatories to use that kind of soft power to really communicate the importance of preservation of heritage object locations, want to establish commonly understood safety zones, and then also think about how those places that we're establishing do not get disturbed by either new activity or even, are we creating new heritage zones? And so I think there's a lot of conversation that still needs to take place. Obviously, NASA is one of many voices as part of this conversation, but really leaning into this kind of shared understanding of the importance of space heritage, and then we all need to work collaboratively and cooperatively to try and establish those new norms and best practices that we want to take forward. I think another question that we're starting to think about is certainly how to determine if the value of a lunar site has also changed. And I think we talked a little bit about that perhaps during the first panel about what is the value of an object, and is that really the true value, or is that just what somebody ascribes to it? So that's another place where we need to do some work to think about how does the value of a particular site change, especially maybe if there's contamination or other activities. What does that mean going forward? And then the final gap that I want to leave is also this question of sustainability. And we talked a little bit before about what do we do with objects. And so NASA recently put out Volume 1 of our Space Sustainability Strategy, which focused on Earth orbit. Future work will be on cislunar, and I think there's lots of interesting questions that we really need to dig into about what does it mean both in cislunar space as well as on the lunar surface, and what happens with an object there. Do you want to leave something in place? Do you want to bring it back? Are there opportunities, especially as commercial industry are thinking about new kinds of capabilities and technologies? Could a company develop the capability to go and pick up one of these objects and repurpose it? And so that brings up, again, registration convention and how ownership is associated with an object. And under the Outer Space Treaty, right, if the U.S. launches something, it is a U.S. object, but what if it's a different company? And so there's a lot of these interesting policy questions that are out there now that NASA is certainly in the mix of these conversations, and we want to tee up the discussions with international partners, with industry partners, because we're going to have to collaborate to solve them. And so I really appreciate everybody coming together for this conversation, because this is how we move forward. Thanks.
Excellent. Mike, did you want to?
I've got that look. Sorry. I just wanted to hit on one important issue. Safety zones. There's a pernicious misperception that safety zones are stay-out zones. Safety zones are not stay-out zones. Safety zones are not exclusionary zones. At least under the paradigm of the Accords, a safety zone is the area within your activity could cause harmful interference to someone else. And instead of creating an ownership, it actually creates an obligation that you have to be public, go to the UN, say where you are, what you're doing, per the concerns that Ellen's raising, and that you have to communicate to anyone else entering into that area, which they absolutely can under Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, to try and talk to each other to avoid that harmful interference. So when we talk about, well, what if someone creates a very broad safety zone? I would say that's wonderful, because then they've got obligations that are even larger. So I just want to make that point because I hear it far too often. Part of the reason heritage is such a difficult issue because it's the one place where there actually would be a stay-out zone or activity, which does not occur under the harmful interference provisions of the Artemis Accords. Sorry.
Right. We can't violate the Outer Space Treaty Articles 1 and 2, principles of free access, no national appropriation. We're not going to create national parks. You can't fence off areas and say you can't go there, right? Or you couldn't stop countries from doing so.
Although under COSPAR, that has been an issue that has been discussed, of reserving areas for scientific research, et cetera. And that's a whole nother topic, again, that crosses over.
And a fascinating one, and I think it has natural connections to the conversation we're having today as well. Mai'a, as a political scientist, I want to do like the 30,000-foot view. And I realize we're running out of time very quickly. I've been a terrible chair of today's panel, but space diplomacy in 2024, and if you don't mind, we'll go cut into lunch just a little bit so we can hear this answer. Space diplomacy in 2024 relies upon a healthy mixture of coordination, cooperation, and yes, competition. And sometimes we hear that it's unlikely that we're going to get another kind of treaty the way that we did in the 60s and 70s with things like the Outer Space Treaty, Registration Convention, Rescue and Return of Astronauts, et cetera. What are the chances for countries meaningfully coming together on this issue and, say, negotiating a treaty, right? And say if the treaty is out, what are some other helpful modalities that the international community can kind of coalesce around in order to advance this particular issue?
Sure, it's a great question. And I think, obviously when you really zoom out, then you see geopolitics and you see China's aggressive behavior, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Wolf Amendment, which prevents the US from cooperating with China. And you almost see sort of some concern about the emergence of two blocks when it comes to space cooperation, with Artemis Accords on the one hand and various efforts China is making on the other hand with its future lunar base and so forth. So there's concern about how can you bridge that and prevent the blocks from kind of solidifying further. But when you kind of separate out all of the rhetoric about space as the next battlefield and the plans, the worst case scenario plans of militaries around the world, I think it would be possible to conceive of some kind of agreement, framework, or treaty that is just specifically focused on heritage and kind of for all humankind. And what does this mean really for humans as a whole? And this kind of comes back to a point I made at the very beginning about sort of the way in which space has this unifying power and the fact that there has been diplomacy in the area of space that touches upon science and culture, even in the worst situations on Earth. So I think it's possible. The binding nature of it would be another question, though. And in some respects, as someone who's not a legal scholar but a politics scholar, I think there are norms and values and principles and processes that we can follow, even if they're not binding. So and they might be even just as powerful, such as, you know, the nuclear weapons taboo, which of course has been tested many times, but still holds. So I wouldn't kind of undercut the value of establishing norms and a common worldview around something, even though binding would be better. And I would say that in order to do something like that, you really have to set up a kind of grassroots groundwork in diplomacy terms, to strengthen how everyone on Earth looks at human heritage in space, so that there is that sense among the regular public and diplomats at the entry level or the mid-career level, that this matters to everyone. And as Michelle was saying, it's not, you know, American artifacts or Chinese artifacts or Russian artifacts, but really human heritage. That kind of viewpoint, I think, can actually easily be strengthened just because of the nature of outer space and the overview effect and so many of the things that are astounding in terms of accomplishments in human history. So, you know, when I go and I'm in fora of international space diplomats from all over the world, there's a bit of this kind of resentment that the Artemis Accords is this US-led thing. And even though I'm not a representative of the US, I try to say, you know, so many efforts have been made to do something from the UN or from a truly kind of non-US led perspective, perhaps, although the US tends to lead in many ways. And they haven't succeeded. The Artemis Accords have succeeded, though. So I think it is actually a strong basis to begin looking at the heritage component and to move everything forward, as Michael said, as the starting point for more discussion, for more codification, and eventually legalization. But the fact that these diplomats from other parts of the world who define themselves as space diplomats are a bit resentful concerns me. And that's where, again, I talk about, you know, communication, persuasion, sort of transnational understandings where a worldview and a common set of norms can be really promoted in this area.
Mike, I think the last word will be yours because we've run out of time, but go.
I apologize, Rolly, this is me. I do want to push back a little bit on the Accords being US-led, or at least that perception. The Accords belong as much to the international partners as the United States. When we were negotiating, any country had veto power over any portion of the Accords. If you think that the English in the Accords is well written, that's because of the Japanese. The inclusive nature of the Accords was driven in no small part by United Arab Emirates. And while the US certainly helped act as a catalyst for the effort, any country can sign at any time. It does not require US permission. We're simply keeping all the records of the Accords. And I do believe, like you, in the unifying power of space. I believe in the dream of Star Trek that was woven into the aspects of the Accords, and no matter how bad things are on Earth, space is that connection that can keep us together. Look at the situation in Russia right now, yet we're still collaborating on the ISS. Space is that last line of communication that is so important to preserve. And I believe that there is great potential for common ground, particularly with the Chinese, on space policy and space issues between the Accords and ILRS. And as you noted, because of the Accords, there is this dialogue. And I think that's going to be happening in the not too distant future in the United Nations, of trying to find the common ground. Because in space, it's not just the technology. We can build better technology, but let's all come together to build a better future for humanity in space. And that's what the purpose of the Accords is. Not only the journey to the moon and Mars, but the destination needs to be peace and prosperity for a united humanity.
Well said. Please join me in congratulating this panel. If you have questions, find us at lunch. I'm sure you're happy to corner us and we can talk more. So thank you so much. And I think with that, we're off to lunch now.
Before you get up, a couple things to say. First of all, hi. Thank you, panel number 2. Thanks, David. Thanks to you all. For panelists, please come to the back corner by the AV. We have something for you all. For everybody, if you flip your name tag, you will see either a green or a red sticker. Everybody who wants to is welcome to join us for these restoration hangar tours, and the docents are in the corner. If you have a green sticker, you're in group 1, so you should go to this corner now. If you have a red sticker, please come back to the same corner at 1 p.m. for the second round of tours. Once people on the tour are done, come eat. People who are in the second group, eat now. And yeah, we will see you back here at 2. Also, the museum is open if you want to take a walk. Thanks so much.